All right. Um, let's see. My name is Dorian. We've met before. I'm the guy who likes to fly his airplane to historical places throughout the West. And together we've traveled along the Oregon Trail and the Lewis and Clark Trail. And tonight's presentation is kind of special for me because I'm a pilot and aviation has been one of the great joys of my life. So in a sense, this is a homage to the Wright Brothers. And I did have a little bit of trouble deciding on what the title of this presentation should be like. So I have an alternate title. Whoops. That was the alternate title. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, we're going to talk about my two favorite mavericks. Two simple, humble bicycle mechanics, neither of whom had a college education, who managed to achieve humankind's long-held dream of flight, a feat which, by the way, eluded the best scientific minds of the time. So how in the world did they do this? Well, I had that question when I bought an airplane over 20 years ago, and I learned that Dayton, Ohio was doing a centennial flight, all things Wright Brothers, in 2003. So I decided to fly out there. And what in this presentation is informed what I learned during that week that I spent there, plus many bibliographies. We are fortunate. The Wright brothers kept a photographic history of the progress they made. And they were men of letters. So there was a lot of communication. So we have good notes and we have a pretty good idea of what was going on. Now, if you were to ask anyone in the 1800s what they thought of the idea of a human flying, this is the most common response you would get. But this wasn't from just anyone. This, in fact, was from Wilbur Wright, the father of the Wright brothers, about the same time, Milton Wright, about the same time that Wilbur was born. Yet in the past century, men of science were working very hard. In fact, when I delved into this and did a lot of research, I was surprised at how much work had been done. But most of it was covered up because you were considered a quack if you were delving in the idea of flying. And it started with the Montgolfier brothers who flew hot air balloons over Paris, a witness, by the way, by Franklin and Jefferson. And from that point on, balloons, people attached engines to balloons, and ultimately we morphed into the famous dirigibles of World War I. The other path of flying was what we called fixed-wing airplanes, the airplanes which you know today. And that got a big boost in the 1890s. Technologies were beginning to converge. We had the internal combustion engine, we had better structures, and things were happening. In fact, in the early 1890s, Maxim and Adair actually made slight little hops. That's not true flying, but they made slight little hops using a steam engine. And it's into this world that we come the Wright brothers. Milton Wright was a minister in an offshoot of a Protestant church. Actually, he was a bishop in that church. He was a man of high integrity and character. He maintained a library for his children at home. He very much believed in self-education. He met his wife, Susan, in college in 1850. It was unheard of for a woman to go to college in 1850, and she majored in science and math, of all things. And she was the daughter of a carriage maker, so in her spare time she would help her father fix carriages. So this lady had mechanical skills, which she passed down to her children, and also to repurpose things around the house, because the Wrights were not people of any major means. There were 5 children. 2 oldest had by this time left the house. They were married, they left the house. That left Susan, who was the only girl and the only one to go to college. She became a teacher. So what we're left with in the middle are the 2 brothers, Orville and Wilbur. Orville was very knowledgeable in science and math. He was a bright, restless young man. He was a bit of a troublemaker. The teachers kind of kept him in the front row to keep track of him. And he was regarded as a mechanical genius. He can kind of envision a mechanism and then build it right there on the spot. Wilbur was an academic and also very athletic. He had passed all the entrance exams for the Yale Divinity School. He wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps. But unfortunately, Wilbur suffered a horrific accident in his senior year in high school. He got hit full force with a hockey stick, which fractured his jaw and knocked out many teeth. This threw him into a deep depression. He spent the next 4 years, he gave up all ideas of going to college. He spent the next 4 years in his room, essentially reading and taking care of his mother, who was dying from tuberculosis. The Wrights were growing up at an interesting age in America in the late 1890s. In the Industrial Revolution, there were many scientific discoveries, and the boys were fascinated with this. We had, as I mentioned, the gas engine, the light bulb, telephone, Marconi's radio, and X-rays. Orville couldn't wait to get into it. So he got fascinated with the whole printing process, and he started a printing process. And he actually designed and built his printing press from junkyard parts. And his business took off and was doing fairly well. So well that he invited Wilbur to come help him out. And this was a lifeline to Wilbur. It kind of pulled him out of his depression. And they were doing very well. They published a weekly newspaper, but unfortunately there was another printing concern that actually overtook them. About this time, the safety bicycle was invented. The safety bicycle is the bicycle you know today, 2 equal-sized wheels. And everyone was going crazy about the bicycle all over the world. The Wrights got into it very deeply. They became racers. Orville was known as a real scorcher in some of his races. And the boys decided to open up a bicycle shop. And over the years, their bicycle shop grew. In fact, they've had something like 4 bicycle shops during the course. In the mid-1890s, Orville got typhoid fever. Typhoid fever back then was not uncommon and usually was very deadly. And he was tied up for a few months. And Wilbur stayed by his side, reading about all the latest developments that were going on. And the whole world was captivated by the flying of Otto Lilienthal. He and his brother had been doing a lot of testing on small miniature wings to try to understand lift and drag. And they also practiced with curved wing structures to get more lift. And they built these beautiful gliders, bird-like gliders, which Otto used to glide down a hill in Germany. But unfortunately, in 1896, he crashed and he broke his neck. So the brothers began discussing how in the world could they avoid such a set of circumstances. And that's when they got really interested in flying. And that led Wilbur to write a now famous letter to the Smithsonian saying, please send me all the information you have about flying. And that led them to a gentleman by the name of Octave Chanute. Octave Chanute was a preeminent civil engineer of the century. He built bridges for the railroads. He was now retired. And he made himself kind of a point of contact for all things that were going on in flying at the time. So, I need a sip of water for this. The Wrights began analyzing the problem, and they saw that there were 4 challenges they had to overcome. The first was understanding lift. What is this force? What is the force which keeps everything going? Well, I studied aerodynamics in college, so I ought to know something about lift. and this is what I've learned. It's magic. We all know it's magic, right? I mean, most of the magic takes place over the wing, some of it over the tail, some of it over the fuselage. It's got to be magic. Do you see any wires holding that wing up or gremlins pushing it up, pushing it up? Do you know people still argue about how to explain lift, even at the most learned institutions? And I read a paper in Scientific American 4 years ago that says we still can't describe lift, interesting enough. And if you go to YouTube, you'll get all kinds of answers. You'll get some that are flat wrong, you'll get some that are partially correct. And you know, every time I fly and I look at my wing, I say, this is amazing. I could soar over mountains, I could slalom between clouds, all because of some invisible magic, science that is taking place over that wing. So I'm going to take a shot at explaining it to you. It's not 100% scientifically correct, but it will introduce you to some of the concepts. And we got the nice picture of Mount Timpanogos in the background here. So this is my wing, as a matter of fact. And as a wing pushes through the air at a slight angle of attack, it kind of squeezes the air above it. And when you put your thumb in a hose, what happens? The water comes out faster, doesn't it? Well, the same thing happens here. The air speeds up over the wing. And we know from something called Bernoulli's theorem that when the air speeds up, the pressure in that air goes down. The pressure on the bottom of the wing is about the same or a little bit higher, but there's a negative pressure on, or a lower pressure on top and a higher pressure on the bottom, and that difference in pressure pulls the wing up. Now it turns out for Christmas, I got this wonderful little gift. I got this desktop wind tunnel. Can you see how the air gets compressed over the top of this little wing, which I had made? Well, in addition, the wing turns, curves the air downward, pushes the air downward. And because of Newton's third law, the air pushes back. If I push on this podium, it pushes back. So for those of you with a scientific bent, what I described was conservation of matter, conservation of energy, and conservation of momentum, the three conditions which Euler famously used to derive the equations that describe the flow over this wing. Okay, that was fun, but that's not very satisfying. Do the Wright brothers really understand this? I don't think so. It doesn't appear to be the case. What they did understand were experiments. And I'll bet you guys have done some experiments yourself. How many of you have been driving and stuck your hand out the window and felt that force, right? And if you haven't, I guess I have to tell you. I know we have some attorneys in here, so I got to be careful. Be careful, all right? Be careful. So if you had your hand tilted at a slight angle, what happens? Your hand goes up and it goes back. You experience an aerodynamic force. Let's let that force be represented by this brown arrow over here. The vertical component of that force we call lift, and the retarding force we call drag. Now your hand is a terrible, terrible wing. The wing in my airplane generates 9 times as much lift as drag. The wing on commercial airliners generates 15 to 20 times as much lift as drag. On the long, thin wing gliders, the lift to drag ratio is 50 to 60 times, which is actually quite amazing. Now, if you played around with your hand, you might have turned it a little bit upward. We call that angle of attack. And what happens, you experience more lift. In fact, for every doubling of that angle, you'll get a doubling in the lift. Speed makes a big difference. If you speed up, for every doubling in the speed of the air over the wing, you'll get a quadrupling of the lift. And air density makes a difference. If your air is more dense, such as when you're at sea level or when it's cold, that increases your lift as well. So let's put it all together. This is a diagram of the Wright Brothers airplane. This is always confusing. This is the front right here. And supposing we have some engines which are driving propellers, and the airplane is gradually taking off. It's moving from right to left, increasing its speed. And as it increases its speed, the lift is increasing until it reaches a point where the lift is equal to the weight of the airplane, and the airplane rises off the ground. And if we continue applying thrust, we'll climb to an altitude which we call cruise altitude, and there our thrust will be equal to our drag and our lift will be equal to our weight. That's the condition where you're sipping a cocktail and watching a movie. Now, the whole process of taking off and cruising to altitude and maintaining flight we call sustained flight. Sustained flight is the holy grail of flying, much different than just hopping. And this is what everyone was trying to achieve. Now, it turns out that the Lilienthals had compiled some lift and drag tables for the wings, which they had used. And they were considered the gold standard at the time. So everyone thought this problem was solved, including the Wright brothers. Everyone would use the Lilienthals lift and drag tables. All right, so problem number one is solved. Next problem is how do we build a structure that is strong enough but light enough to hold everything together? Well, remember I mentioned Octave Chanute. When Octave Chanute retired, he also did some glider experiments, and he built this glider, which, by the way, looks a little bit like a bridge truss, doesn't it? And the Wrights adopted it, giving him full credit for the design. And they went on to make many significant improvements to it. The next challenge is propulsion. Can we build a lightweight but powerful engine to drive our airplane through the air? Well, interesting enough, the Wrights decided to put this problem off because they did not know the lift and drag characteristics of the vehicle they would be flying. They would have to test that. So they decided once they had that information, then they would turn their attention back to propulsion. But they didn't think this was a big problem because there were many internal combustion engines out there at the time. So they thought this would be simple. And finally, the last challenge is stability and control. Controlling an airplane in the air in multiple dimensions is much more difficult than steering a ship in the sea or a car on the ground. This, interesting enough, is where the Wright brothers thought they could make their unique contribution. At this point, they were not really trying to be the first to fly. This was a hobby to them, which they were doing on their own dime. So let's talk a little bit about how you control an airplane in the air. Usually I have a model to do this, but it's a little bit hard today to do that. We have what are called three axes of control. We have a pitch. Pitch is this movement, which I'll illustrate in a second, which we do with the use of a front elevator. Almost all airplanes today have an elevator in the rear, but the Wright brothers put their elevator in the front. There are aerodynamic advantages to putting it in the front. But apparently the Wrights weren't shooting for that. The Wrights knew there would be crashes, and they wanted a bumper out there to take up the impact when they crashed. That was one reason. The other reason is that they thought they might stall at some point in time. If they stalled, they wanted to kind of fall down like a leaf. So to illustrate this, I have a model which I built years ago of the Wright Flyer. Here is Orville. It's a little bit hard to see, but can you see that he's sitting in a cradle? Over there. He's also controlling a stick, and that stick moves this elevator up or down. So by pulling on the stick, he will move the elevator up, which increases the lift on the elevator, and that rotates the whole airplane up, which increases the lift on the main wing, and the airplane climbs. And if you want to go down, you just reverse the process, okay? Very few people were thinking about doing this. The thinking of the time was that it was almost impossible for a human to control an airplane. birds had evolved, for millions of years to do this, but people probably could not do it, was the current belief. So people were trying to invent airplanes that would basically fly by themselves. The next axis of control is yaw. We don't want to be flying along and then suddenly have the airplane swap ends as we're flying along. Not much fun for that to happen. So the Wrights came up with something that everybody was using at the time, and it was called directional stability, or sometimes windsock stability, and that is to put a fin in the rear of the airplane. So as you're flying, if the airplane would veer off to the right, the wind would hit the fin and bring it round back into the wind. It's the same principle with feathers on an arrow and the rear of the arrow. Everyone was doing this. There was nothing unique to this. The next challenge was, how do you turn the airplane? Now you might think, well, gee, I'll just put a rudder in the back and I'll just turn the airplane like I would on a ship. Well, if you do that, then you're yawing the airplane around, and as I previously discussed by directional stability, the airplane will go right back into the same direction it's traveling. It turns out you can make some incremental changes in the direction of the airplane, but that's very difficult. The Wrights studied birds, and they noticed that when a bird wanted to turn left, it would increase the angle of attack of its right wing and decrease the angle of attack of its left wing. That increased the lift on this wing and decreased the lift on this wing, and the bird would roll into a turn. We call this rolling by differential lift. But how do you do this on a rigid structure like an airplane? Well, legend has it that one day Wilbur was in his bicycle shop. He had just sold a tire to a customer, and he was chatting with the customer, and he had an empty box, and he began fiddling with it. And he squeezed the opposite corners, and you see what happens to this box. It twists. We call this, or they call this, wing warping. So what they did is to rig up some cables from that cradle, you see there, to the ends of the wing so they can pull on the wing. You see how that is bending right there? And they were able to do that because this strut, and this strut here were all hinged. So now they can warp their wings to increase or decrease the lift on the ends of their wings and turn. No one was thinking about this at all. Now, it turns out the Wrights really thought this through pretty very well. I mean, for someone who had no experience. They did leave one thing out, which they'll discover during experiment. This is a picture of me trying to explain this to Orville. Now, the Wrights decided, it's one thing to have some ideas about things, it's another thing to build them. So they thought, well, maybe I ought to build some gliders and see what it's like to see if these concepts really work. Now, they could have done their gliding right there in Dayton, Ohio, but they were a little smarter than that. They reasoned that if they could glide off a hill into a wind that was equal to the same speed as their glide speed, then they would remain stationary over the hill, just like you see a bird hover over a hill. If that was the case, then they could hook up a cable to the airplane, put a scale on it, and they can measure the actual lift and drag of their glider. So they needed to find a place with reliably strong winds. They contacted the weather department. They looked at several places, and we all know that they decided to go to Kitty Hawk. Kitty Hawk was actually back then a very remote fishing village of 200 people, 4 miles north in this direction over here. Kitty Hawk had reliably strong winds, anywhere from about 20 to 30 miles an hour. And the reason they chose Kitty Hawk was they started writing letters to William Tate, who was a former postmaster general there. And Tate said, there are members of a life-saving station there who would be happy to help them out with their experiments. And they knew they would need lots of hands. Very isolated place. Today, this is Kill Devil Hill. This is the area where most of the glides took place. And today there is a monument to the Wright Brothers on top. And there's a museum over here. And right over here are replicas of the Wright Brothers hut and their hangar. And you can't see it, but right over here is where they conducted their first powered flights, which we're going to talk about. Did I say that this was all sand back then? That was another reason I liked this place. Nice, soft, cushy landing. So the Hawkers promised they would help them with their experiments. Okay, so they went there in 1900. And by the way, living there was rather primitive. They had to bring their gliders or the materials for the gliders. They had to bring their tools. There were no services in Kitty Hawk, so they had to bring all their food in cans with one little stove, and they had to dig a well. So it was quite a struggle just to live there. They showed up in 1900, and they showed up with a small glider just to test out some of their ideas, and their elevator wing worked just fine. They were very pleased with that and very encouraged. But they noticed that when you can see the cable they have here, when they measured the lift and drag on their glider, it was nowhere near the prediction. It was off by a half to 1/3. And I thought, well, maybe the glider is just a little bit too small for our experiments. So they came back the next year, and the next year was a disaster. There were hurricanes. There was a lot of rain. There were mosquitoes, and nothing was working. They were crashing left and right. Lift force was still only 50% of expected. And then a new thing came up, which we call adverse yaw. They would go to turn left, and suddenly the airplane would veer to the right. They would go to turn right, and suddenly the airplane would veer to the left. They had no idea what was going on, totally confused. They left terribly discouraged. On the way back, Wilbur wrote in his diary that humankind will not fly for another 50 years. But there were two people who encouraged them to go on. One was their sister, Susan, who had complete confidence in her brothers, and the other was Octave Chanute. Octave Chanute arranged for Wilbur to give a couple of talks at the Society of Civil Engineers. And Wilbur was a very methodological person, and the society really appreciated the work which he had done, and that encouraged them to move on. So the Wright brothers put their heads together. And by the way, the way Wright brothers solved the problems was very unique. They would argue, and I don't mean just like you and I having a discussion across the table. This was a full-throat shouting match that would start in the morning, continue in the evening, continue the next day. Sometimes they would change positions, but by the time they were done, they understood exactly what was going on. And you know, we have a saying today for that kind of process, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Are you ready? Two rights never make a wrong. That's the dyslexic version, in case you're interested. So they argued and they produced this wind tunnel. They were not the first to invent the wind tunnel. The wind tunnel was invented 30 years before, but again, they made major improvements to it, came up with this very unique and clever balance to measure lift and drag. And they learned, and they tested over 200 miniature airfoils, which you can see, and they learned two things which were very important. One, the wing curvature that the Lilienthal was using was too great, and that was causing instabilities and causing some of the crashes. The other was that the longer wings with what we call higher aspect ratio, have better lift to drag. So now they had a tool. No one else had this tool to design their airplanes. They shared this with Octave Chanute. They always had a running dialogue with Chanute. And without their consent, Chanute shared it with the French. French have always felt that they were the cradle of aviation. And this was a big bonus to them. And this was the beginning of the end of the relationship between the Wrights and Octave Chanute. So now they had the tools to design a glider, and they went back in 1902. And now look at this glider. You see how long the wings are here? So they lifted, they measured their lift and the drag, and guess what? It was dead on with what they had experimented with. They were very pleased about that. But once again, they started turning, and they would get this adverse yaw thing. You know, totally perplexing. One night, Orville drank too much coffee. He couldn't sleep. He pondered the problem all night long. And in the morning, he said, Will, I know what the problem is. He said, we forgot. When you increase the lift on the wing, you also increase the drag. So the lift on the wingtips is pulling the wingtip back. And the way we ought to overcome that is by having a movable rubber to counteract that force. So within a matter of 3 days, they fixed up a moving rudder, and they ran those cables directly to the cradle, which they would move left and right or the bank. So all they had to do is move the cradle. And this is a very natural situation for bicycle riders, right? What do you do when you want to turn left on your bike? You lean left or you lean right. So this was very easy for them to do. And Wilbur said, from the moment he took flight, he knew they had solved the problem. So now the boys had conquered 3-axis control. And they spent the rest of the summer, it said they did 1,000 flights. It's a little hard for me to believe that, but they spent the rest of the summer taking turns flying down hills and learning how to fly. They were having a ball. They were like 2 kids on a sled. Here's something I find interesting. Look at Wilbur over here. What is he wearing in a hot, humid summer with sand flying in his face? A starched white shirt, a starched high collar, and a tie. Well, part of it is that's the way people were back then. But also the Wrights thought this would add some gravitas to their photographs. They hoped someday these would be historic documents. All right, all we got to do now is plug in that engine and we are ready to go. Now they're asking themselves, hey, maybe we can be the first ones to fly. So they, from their calculations, they determined they needed an 8-horsepower engine, but they wanted it to weigh under 200 pounds. So they asked engine builders, do you have such an engine? No, none of them had one that was that light. So what they did is they sketched out a 4-cylinder engine on a piece of scrap paper, and they gave it to their good friend, Charlie Taylor, who was an excellent machinist. And Taylor worked on it for 6 weeks, and he produced not 8 horsepower, but 12 horsepower, 12 horsepower engine. And it weighed under 200 pounds. And why is that? Well, they made it from a material which was little known back then. Of course, aluminum. They were the first ones to build an aluminum engine. The next part they thought would be easy. We'll just use a ship's propeller to drive, this airplane. They realized very quickly that it was totally inadequate. They realized that basically a propeller was a rotating wing, but the tips of the wing spin faster than the hub of the wing. Therefore, you have to twist the propeller in order to get equal lift along its length. This is a very complex problem for 2 guys with just a high school education. It's even more complex because you have to factor in the speed of the airplane through the air. The first propeller they designed is right here. It had a 65% efficiency. That is, 65% of this horsepower would be converted to thrust. They were aiming for 50%. Over the years, they improved their propeller design until they achieved 80%. The propeller in my airplane is 88%. 90% is considered the maximum efficiency you can get out of a propeller. So here the Wrights, over 4 years, had basically invented propeller design. And I'm with Charlie Taylor on this. They really never got enough credit for this. Totally revolutionized things. So they had everything they needed. Behold, the first flying machine capable of sustained flight, heavier than air. It weighed 605 pounds. It had 40-foot wings. And by the way, the wingspan of my airplane is 39 and a half feet. It was designed to travel at 30 miles an hour. And it was actually built in 3 sections, a center section and the 2 wing sections. They could not assemble it in Dayton. There was not enough room. So they wouldn't assemble until they actually got the Kitty Hawk. Since they would be taking off on sand, they designed a rail, and they had some bicycle hubs which they placed on their vehicle to ride down the rail. And they had some skids so they could land on the sand. And the whole airplane was constructed out of muslin fabric, which you can buy in any store. They used something called Pride of the West. Pride of the West was a tight weave back then, and it was used for women's undergarments. They would stretch this fabric from the rear end of the airplane to the front, pulling it tight, and then tacking it in the front. People who met the Wright brothers commented on how large and how strong their hands were. Well, this is from pulling that fabric tight over their wings. The propellers, by the way, rotated in opposite directions to cancel out the torque. The Wrights pretty much thought of everything. But something else was happening. There's a gentleman by the name of Samuel Langley, who was then the director of the Smithsonian Institute. 7 years prior to this, he had built a remotely controlled airplane which flew for a mile. He got $50,000 for the Army, equivalent to about $1 million today, to build a scaled-up version of this airplane. And by the way, Samuel Langley knew what was going on with the Wrights. He sent spies down the Kitty Hawk to keep an eye on them. Right? He wanted to beat them. If you go to the Udvar Hazy Museum, which is an annex to Dulles Airport, you can see a replica of this airplane. It's a little bit hard to see here. It's called a tandem wing design. There's a wing in the front and there's a wing in the rear. And you can see it's a rather flimsy structure, held together with cables, braced with cables, also on the top. Look at the propeller. It looks like a windmill back here. This little pod is where the pilot would sit. Not controllable. But it had one thing the Wrights didn't have. 50 horsepower. 4 times what the Wrights had. You know, with enough power, you can fly just about anything. So if you were a betting person, this is the airplane that you would think would be the first to fly. So Langley was ready. He put his airplane on a houseboat in the middle of the Potomac River. He launched it with a catapult, and it folded up like a piece of origami. The pilot almost drowned, by the way. This was in December, right? The water was very cold. So, by the way, the press were merciless. They hounded this man. They drove him to his death. Even Wilbur defended him. And Samuel Langley did make many contributions to the science of flight, but he didn't deserve what he got. So now the road was clear for the Wright brothers. Let's take a look at this photograph. Here is the rail that I mentioned. You see over here, there's undisturbed sand. That's where the airplane was originally, with this wingtip resting on this bench over here. Okay. So on December the 14th, the boys flipped a coin to see who would fly first. Wilbur got the honor. But as soon as Wilbur took off, there was a sudden gust, and that downed him. So it was Orville's turn now on December the 17th. The airplane was put back here. It was held by a catch. Wilbur went back and turned over the propellers. Orville juiced up the engine. The wind was about 25 miles an hour. And Orville looked to his brother, nodded his head, released the catch, and the airplane shot into the air. And I love this picture of a Wilbur just, I don't know, stunned, excited by what was going on here. The plane flew 120 feet. This was the first sustained flight. If you're a pilot, your pilot's license contains this image, as you might expect. Wilbur said, "Oh, my turn. I can't wait." Wilbur got on there and he flew at 175 feet on the second flight. Orville said, "I think I got the knack." 200 feet on the third flight. And then finally Wilbur said, "No, I really know what's going on here." And by the way, this airplane took a lot of control. I've flown a simulator and I crashed it right from the start. He flew almost 3 football fields. In fact, he said he felt so good that he was going to turn north and fly over Kitty Hawk, but then there was a sudden gust of wind and this happened, damaging the front elevator. And I like this picture because in the back you can see Kill Devil Hill. A moment after this picture was taken, another gust of wind flipped the airplane over and crushed it beyond repair. This was in a shed in Dayton for many years until it was reconstructed, and it now hangs in the Smithsonian on the Washington Wall. Have any of you seen it there? I think they've just restored it, if I'm not mistaken. So they sent off this telegram. Their brother picked it up in Dayton. He brought it to the papers. They went to the Dayton paper, and the editor said, "This is not newsworthy." I mean, one of the greatest achievements went unreported because the editor thought it was not newsworthy. This was the beginning of lots of problems that the Wright brothers had with the press. They really needed a press agent. So now the Wrights say, well, we got to build another airplane. So they built a replica of the Wright Flyer 1, the Wright Flyer 2, and they began flying it at a place called Huffman Prairie. Huffman Prairie is an annex today to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And if you visit it, as I have, you got to be careful. If you make the wrong turn, 2 nice young men in M16s will stop you. Don't ask me how I know. It's a little bit hard. It's a little bit hard to find. All right. Immediately they ran into problems. The airplane wouldn't climb. Well, first of all, they were doing their testing in March. It was a lot warmer than it was in Kitty Hawk. And also, Dayton, Ohio is 1,000 feet above sea level, so the air is thinner there. So the engine wasn't running up to snuff, and the lift wasn't as great as it should be. The Wrights didn't fully understand this. But finally, they did get it flying. They did an unassisted takeoff in May of 2004, a circling flight in September of 2004. Then they struck upon the idea, well, gee whiz, instead of building a long rail, why don't we just build a catapult and launch us in there into the sky so that we could basically have a portable runway wherever they went to. And this made a lot of differences. This airplane, again, was very hard to fly. In fact, it was a very serious crash where Orville almost lost his life. So the Wrights said, well, we'll design another one called the Wright Flyer 3. This is quite often called the first practical airplane. It looks exactly like the other airplanes, but there are some subtle differences. By the way, this airplane was restored personally by Orville Wright in the 1940s. The nose is much longer, so they had better pitch control. They had a 25 horsepower engine. It was beefed up a lot so that it was a lot more durable. Even the tail was extended a little bit further out here. This airplane, they could fly in any conditions at any time, which they did. And in 2005, they did a 24-mile, 40-minute flight in the Flyer 3. A little hard to see here. This is the Wright Flyer 3, but you might notice that the pilot, I don't know who was flying at the time, was raising his head up. Can you imagine flying for 40 minutes, lying down with just your neck up very, very uncomfortable. Now, interestingly, when they first started, they invited the press to witness what they were doing. It was a bad day. They couldn't get the engine running properly, and the press were totally unimpressed. And what's more, they would not permit the press to take detailed photographs of their airplane because they knew that would give away a lot of their secrets. And the press did not like that, did not like that at all. So they totally banned them. But people saw them fly. See this row of trees over here? There's a commuter train that goes through there, and people would go to work in the morning and they'd see the Wrights flying above them. People began showing up at Hoffman Prairie. They were fascinated what was going on. And the word was getting out, even though the press wasn't reporting on it. And soon the French came over. They wanted to see what was going on. And the English came over as well. So they were generating a lot of interest. And about this time, they thought, well, maybe instead of being bicycle mechanics, we can make our living building and flying airplanes. So they went to the War Department. They were rejected twice. They wanted to build a scout plane for them. And they decided they better stop flying because now the word was getting out. People were taking pictures, and they decided to patent their work. Meanwhile, the French were showing a lot of interest. These were the winds of war coming up in Europe. So the French, the Germans, and the British were all interested in flying machines. So Wilbur went to France. He spent a year there trying to negotiate a contract. No luck. I shouldn't say that. There was one government official who said, "Oh, we'll give you a contract as long as you give us a bribe." And Wilbur said, "No way." That was the end of that. And then at the end of the year, interesting enough, a French consortium gave them a contract for $25,000 to build a flyer that could carry another pilot and to train that pilot. And I guess the Army said, well, we can't let the French get ahead of us. So the Army gave them a contract too. So now the Wrights had a problem. It was a good problem, but it was a problem. How are you going to build two airplanes? These boys were like brothers. They had always done things together. So now they had to separate their efforts. So Orville would be in charge of the Army contract, and Wilbur would go to France to build his vehicle. He goes to Le Mans, which is where the testing would take place, with his Model A flyer. He picked up his airplane at the port, he uncrated it, and it was in ruins, totally destroyed. Some people say it was sabotaged. However, he had to repair it. He basically had to rebuild it, including parts of the engine by himself. He did it at I think it was a Mercedes automobile factory. He got to know the factory owner pretty well. But this delayed him. And the French, very proud of what was becoming a burgeoning aviation industry in France, made all kinds of fun of the Wright brothers. With every delay, they would say, "Are you flyers or are you liars? Can we really trust what you're saying?" So Wilbur was finally ready for his flight. People came from as far as Paris, which is a 4-hour train ride, to observe this. And he actually put them off on 3 occasions because the conditions were not good. He did not want a terrible crosswind. He knew he made one mistake and the press would go crazy and that would ruin everything. But on August the 8th, 1908, he turned to the organizers and he said, "Gentlemen, I am going to fly." He took his hat, he turned it around, they started his propellers, he launched into the air, and he headed a mile down towards a forest, and the crowd gasped. They knew for sure he was going to crash. And instead, he made a graceful turn, came all the way back, and landed right where he took off. And the crowd was stunned. They had never seen anything like this. They rushed to the airplane. He barely was able to turn off the propellers. To the credit of the French press, they adopted him. He was now a Frenchman. And throughout France, people cried, "He flies, he flies." And now he was an expert in everything. He wrote back to his brother, he said, "Before the flight, I could do nothing right. After the flight, I could do nothing wrong." Now, I have seen dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures of Wilbur Wright. In all those pictures, he's a very dour, serious-looking guy. This is the only one I have found where he is smiling. All his life he was told that pride is a sin, but he couldn't help himself. This was after his second flight. Everyone, like I said, was going crazy. Posters were commissioned to celebrate the event. Fashion designers started selling Wilbur caps. Songs were written. Toys were made. You know, if Wilbur knew something about merchandising, he'd make a lot of money. So here is a early film of Wilbur at Le Mans. Let's see if I can get it working. I just lifted this off the internet. Oh, we don't have any sound. Well, that's okay. So here he's putting a cradle to move the airplane around. And they're going to place it. They are going to place it on the rail very shortly. Here's the rail. And Wilbur's will be talking to two gentlemen. One is Hartberg, who was his agent. That's Hartberg. And this is Leon Boulay, who owned that Mercedes factory. And Wilbur's actually going to take Hart for a flight. Here you see the men lifting up the weight. If the press did show up, he made the press pull this. Here he's starting up. And there is Hartberg taking his position on the airplane. And Wilbur, like any good pilot, will test out his controls. And the weight is dropped, and the airplane takes off. A little hard to see. This is what amazed people, how stable and controllable the airplane was. And here he actually is going to begin to do a little bit of hot dogging over here. He's going to dip his wing down close to the ground just to demonstrate how much control he has. Look at this. Then he comes around and he lands very softly. People had never seen anything like this. Meanwhile, Orville was putting together his airplane to satisfy the military requirements, which were he would have to carry a Army lieutenant, and he would have to fly, I think it was about 40 miles an hour over a great distance. So Orville built his airplane and he began testing it at a place called Fort Myers outside of Washington. Anybody know Fort Myers at all? It's really not a good place to fly airplanes. I mean, it's rutted. It's a small parade field. It's a terrible place, actually. He was under a tremendous amount of pressure. Congress adjourned to come watch him fly. So he flew initially by himself in order to just get a feel for the airplane. And he began setting records. So he was setting records, and then Wilbur in Europe was setting records. And for 3 weeks, the whole world was transfixed by these two brothers who were outdoing one another in their flying. So finally it came time for Orville to take up Lieutenant Selfridge. They climbed up, they circled around, everything was going fine, and suddenly there was a terrible crack. And the propeller had snapped off and entangled into the control wires, and the plane plummeted 100 feet, throwing both men forward. There were no seatbelts at the time. Selfridge got a fracture in his skull, 2 fractures in his skull, and he died immediately. First aviation casualty. Orville was badly injured. He had a displaced pelvis, he had a broken femur, he had ribs, contusions. They took him to the local hospital. He was in a terrible state. He was delirious. When Susan, his sister, found out in Dayton, she rushed on a midnight train, came to the hospital room, and basically moved in there with him. The doctor said he would never walk again. One leg was longer than the other. But within 6 weeks, he walked out of there on a cane. Went home to recover in Dayton, Ohio. Of course, Wilbur felt terrible about this. He thought it was his fault for not being there with his brother. Wilbur said, hey, why don't you guys come over to Europe and watch me do all kinds of demonstrations? Because Wilbur was now doing demonstrations to heads of state, to dukes and duchesses and princes, the King of Spain, the King of England. And they said, sure. Look at the look on Orville's face. For the Wrights, it was all about family. He was so happy just to be back with his brother. That's Catherine over there. Catherine had never been beyond Dayton, so this was a wonderful experience for her. She got to see all the art museums. Each day, she spent 2 hours studying France. She became their spokesman during this time. The first woman to fly was his agent's wife, Edith Berg. And here's something interesting about this picture. You might notice that her skirt is tied up in twine over here, right? When the Paris fashion designers saw this, they said, oh, this is great. And they invented the hobble skirt after watching her try to get into this airplane. You know, I think it took a lot of courage to fly in this thing. You just got one thing to hold on to, put your feet down, no seatbelt, no goggles, and you fly maybe 100 or 200 feet. Catherine went up 3 times. There she is. She also has her skirt tied. And the Wrights participated in some air races. Finally, the U.S. embraces the Wright brothers, totally ignored in this country, praised in Europe. And now they came back, and Dayton had a 2-day parade for the Wright brothers, and they met President Taft. What did the brothers do between their celebrations? They rushed back to their bicycle shop and prepared their Army airplane so they can complete their trials. Wilbur insisted on actually doing the flying because Orville had just badly damaged itself a year ago. But Orville said, no, I started this, I'm going to do that. And I think if you talk to any pilot, you talk to any pilot who hasn't flown for a year, you're a little uncomfortable. If I don't fly for a long time, I go up with an instructor just to make sure I feel comfortable. But Orville said, it's my job. There he is, and there is Wilbur talking to Lieutenant Lamb, who would be the next person to fly. Let's see if this video will work. This picture was actually taken by Thomas Edison. Watch what happens when the airplane takes off. Bounce, bounce. Ugh, pretty ugly. Immediately he has to turn because there's no room and hard to see, but he's struggling to climb. It doesn't look like he's going to make it, but suddenly look what happens. He turns around into the wind, and the airplane begins to gain altitude. So he completed all the trials. They completed the contract, $25,000. Someone once asked the Wright brothers, why haven't you ever married? And they said, we were too busy. They worked at their bicycle shop during the day. At night, they worked on the airplane. They always took one day off on Sunday. And you can see that Wilbur was not at all happy when a photographer took his picture. I think their father described them best. He said they were basically twins, even though they were separated by 4 years. Their voices were indistinguishable. They completed each other's sentences. They were happiest when they were working together in the shop. They would hum tunes. Believe it or not, they had a good sense of humor. They loved playing with their brother's children, and they made toys and games for them. But technology was overtaking the Wrights. Again, the French and the Germans, pushed by the winds of war, were making tremendous developments. And the Wrights maintained their leadership up until about 1910 with the Wright B. This airplane is called the headless. It's a different design. You see there's no elevator in the front. The elevator is in the rear. This particular airplane was flown, sponsored by the Vin Fizz. That was a popular carbonated drink of the 1900s. It flew across the country from New York to Long Beach. And when I was in Dayton, I was fortunate. They built a replica, not really a replica, I used modern day engines. But we were belted and we had goggles. And I don't know how in the world you could travel without goggles going at 40 miles an hour. It's just beyond me. It would have been a lot smarter to have a helmet, but we didn't have a helmet. And I got to fly the 1910 replica. By the way, Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to fly. He flew in a plane just like this. The Wrights had patents, and those patents, they could charge a royalty to anyone who was going to fly either in the United States or in Europe. And Glenn Curtis, who was actually a genius unto himself, did not want to pay any of those royalties. So he challenged the Wright Brothers' patents. And Wilbur had to defend them all. He was called to many depositions across the country, and it really wore him out. And then he unfortunately got typhoid fever, and he died in his 40s. Now he died in May of 1912. Does anyone recall what happened in the spring of 1912? The Titanic, exactly. So all the news was consumed with the Titanic, and no one really noted Wilbur's passing. Orville was destroyed. He didn't know how to live without his brother. He sold, by this time they had built a factory to build different airplanes and to train pilots, including the famous Hap Arnold of World War II. He sold the factory and he built a little laboratory, and he went on to invent things. He invented the autopilot and the pilot's drone, something called the split flap. In World War II, he even worked on cipher machines as well. I wish the Wright brothers could see some of the things. This is an example of the Wright brothers flight control perfected that I'm sure most of you have seen. Using basically the same techniques, differential lift, a fin, a rudder, and pitch control. Just 66 years after the first flight, another famous Ohioan, Neil Armstrong, first set foot on the moon. I'm sure everyone here saw that. But did you remember that Neil brought along a swatch of the Wright Flyer 1 and a piece of its propeller? And he spent a few moments paying homage to the Wright brothers as the men who set them on this path to the moon. So thank you for your patience. This is the proper way to say what the Wright brothers did. They invented the first piloted, heavier than air, powered airplane in history capable of controlled, sustained flight. This is the way it is stated in the Smithsonian. And to do that, they definitively solved all the challenges of flight, not just throwing things together, but using the scientific method. And they risked their lives in the flight testing. Many people copy the Wright designs, even violating their patents. And this advanced aviation probably 20 years. It's been speculated that if the Wright brothers didn't happen, we may not have had, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, we may not have had airplanes in World War I. They did more than just invent the airplane. They basically invented aeronautical science as we know it. All the steps they took are the steps we currently use in designing airplanes. So there you have it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience. By the way, a good book to read is by David McCulloch on the Wright Brothers. He always tells a good human interest story. Oh, wait. I think my wife put that one in there. Any questions? Yes.
So I wondered on all these early flights, how did they actually land without crashing? I mean, they're landing in sand.
They're landing in the sand. Well, they had those skids way out in front, but sometimes they would dig in, and the plane would tip a little bit. Sometimes they would hit a sideways force. They didn't know how to deal with a sideways wind, and they would dip their wing. That's why they built the Wright Flyer 3, because the Wright Flyers 1 and 2, although very light, because they really never had enough power. The Wright engines were always a little bit underpowered. Their airplanes were rather flimsy. The Wright Flyer 1 and 2 were rather flimsy. Yes?
Did they work with the military during the wars?
Yes, I think Orville worked on the split flap design. And I don't know who he worked with, what company he worked with, but he did work on ciphering machines as well. But that was the extent of it.
I had a lot of family who was Army Air Force.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Orville became kind of a recluse. He really did not like to go out. He wanted to stay with his laboratory. His brother did all the talking for them, by the way. So, he was lost. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm just wondering, which was the older of the two?
Excuse me, Wilbur.
Thank you.
Wilbur, yes. Wilbur was 4 years older.
The dates were-
Yeah.
all right, thank you.
Yes.
Do you know if the Wright Flyers were ever used in World War I, or did they pass that on?
No, I don't think so. I think by this time, the French and the Germans, the engine development was just spectacular over this time. I mean, they were going into 50, 100 horsepower and building bi-wing designs. But the Wright Flyers, basically after 1910, 1911, their designs were obsolete. They were obsolete. They were good for maybe training people. One of the problems is that the U.S. Army never picked up on this. They never developed past the Wright Flyer. They weren't all that interested. Whereas the French and the Germans, of course, they were going to fight a war. They were going to fight a war. And interesting enough, even after World War I, the U.S. Army ignored aviation. And there's a famous general by the name of Billy Mitchell who challenged them to change all that. But the Army, the Army was kind of stuck with tanks and infantry. Yes?
The trip that they took across country at 40 miles an hour, how long did it take?
Well, that wasn't done by them. That was done, I can't think of the name of the guy who did that. He flew something called the Vinfits. By the way, I have a piece of fabric from the Vinfits. He crashed just about every other day. And in fact, he followed a railroad track, which had all kinds of supplies and to repair the airplane. By the time the airplane arrived in Long Beach, it looked just about nothing like the original airplane because it was repaired so many times. But they did it. They did it. By the way, I just read a book about the first flight around the world. That was only done, I think, 15 years after that flight. It's quite amazing. Yes?
What about the Wright engines that were powering the World War II bombers? Was that their company?
I don't know that much about it. I know that a merger was forced between the Wright Company and Glenn Curtiss to develop engines. So you're thinking of the Wright Cyclone and things of that nature. I think it did have its origins in that merger, but by this time Glenn Curtiss had retired well before that time. There was one very sad post note on this that I'll just mention. The the airplane that the Smithsonian had developed by Langley was a major embarrassment for the Smithsonian. And the new director of the Smithsonian wanted to atone for that. And his idea of atoning was proving that Samuel Langley's airplane was really the first one capable of flying. So you know what he did? He contracted Curtiss Wright, who were enemies of the Wright brothers, to build a new version of that airplane, the Langley airplane. And it was a totally new version. I mean, it was strengthened, the wing was changed, everything was changed. And Curtiss Wright did get it to lift off a lake in upper state New York. This was after Wilbur died, and Orville went crazy. And Orville said, I will never hang my airplane in the Smithsonian. He hung it overseas in England. He hung it at MIT, but he would never hang it at the Smithsonian. It wasn't until the 1940s where an agreement was made. And those words that I showed you, that the Smithsonian would recognize this as the first airplane to fly. Really a sad note for the Smithsonian. Thank you.